The old man's hand was shaking when the dog finally took the food from his fingers. He didn't flinch. He never flinched anymore. 79 years old, sitting on the edge of a cracked wooden bench behind St. Aldrich's Church, feeding a stray dog scraps of bread from his coat pocket like he'd done every single morning for the past 3 years. Rain, frost, or fog, it didn't matter. Nobody in town knew his name. They just called him the old man with the dog, and most people walked right past him without a second look. What they didn't know was that this man once carried other men out of burning buildings. What they didn't know was that his hands, the same hands trembling as he broke off pieces of bread, had once held a rifle steady enough to save an entire platoon. His name was Walter Combs, and nobody in this town had any idea who he really was. The dog, thin, scruffy, one ear torn at the tip, pressed its head gently against Walter's knee. He scratched behind its ears and murmured something too quiet for anyone to hear. "You're the only one who still shows up, aren't you?" he said. The dog just wagged its tail, unaware that it was the closest thing to family this old soldier had left. That morning, a woman in a sharp navy coat walked past the churchyard gate. She was the town's newly appointed judge, Eleanor Reese, successful, respected, and in a hurry as always. She barely glanced at the old man on the bench. To her, he was just another fixture of the neighborhood, like the crooked gravestones or the ivy climbing the church walls. She had no idea that in a few days, this man's past would collide with her present in a way she never could have imagined. If you believe small moments like this one still matter, an old man sharing his last piece of bread with a stray, then you already understand why this story needs to be told. Stay with me because what happens next will change how you see him completely. 3 days later, the dog didn't show up. Walter waited on the bench for 2 hours, bread going stale in his pocket, before an old groundskeeper mentioned that animal control had picked up a scruffy terrier near the churchyard the day before. Reports of a loose, aggressive stray had come in. Someone had complained. Walter's chest tightened. He'd buried friends. He'd survived things most people couldn't imagine. But the thought of that dog locked in a cage, confused and alone, undid something in him that decades of hardship never had. He walked 4 miles to the shelter. His knees screamed the whole way. When he arrived, the woman at the counter looked at his worn coat, his shaking hands, and his quiet, careful voice, and told him the dog wasn't available for release. Not without an owner on record, and certainly not to a man who couldn't prove he could care for it. Walter didn't argue. He simply asked to see the dog one last time. That's when Judge Eleanor Reese walked in, dropping off paperwork for a separate case, and overheard the conversation. Something about the old man's voice, steady, dignified, but breaking at the edges, made her stop and turn around. "Sir," she said, "is this your dog?" Walter looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "He's not mine," he said, "but he's the only one who ever waited for me." Eleanor didn't know why those words hit her the way they did. She'd spent years in courtrooms hearing people lie, manipulate, and plead. This felt different. This felt true. She asked the shelter to hold the dog for 24 hours. Then she did something unusual for a woman with her schedule. She followed Walter outside and asked him to tell her his story. What she learned over the next hour rewrote everything she thought she understood about the quiet old man from the churchyard. Walter had served 2 decades in the military. Search and rescue mostly, the kind of missions that don't make headlines because the men who complete them never talk about them. He'd pulled 12 soldiers out of a collapsed bunker during a night raid that should have killed him twice over. He'd received medals he never picked up, because by the time the ceremony came, he'd already resigned to care for his dying wife. After she passed, he had no children, no close family, and no interest in medals or attention. He sold the house they'd shared, moved into a small flat above the bakery, and spent his mornings at the churchyard bench because it was the only place that felt like it still had room for him. The dog had wandered in one autumn morning, hungry and limping. Walter fed him. The next day, the dog came back. And the day after that. It was the first time in years Walter had something waiting for him. Eleanor sat in stunned silence. This man, dismissed by an entire town as invisible, had quietly saved a dozen lives before most of them were even born. The next morning, without telling Walter, Eleanor made calls. She spoke to the shelter director. She spoke to a local reporter she trusted. She spoke to the town council about a decorated veteran who had never once asked for recognition, living quietly among people who had walked past him for years without knowing what he carried. When Walter returned to the shelter, the dog was already waiting for him. Leash, papers, and adoption fee fully covered. But that wasn't the twist that broke him. Waiting beside the dog was a small group of townspeople, the ones who used to nod politely at the old man with the dog and nothing more. They'd read the story overnight. They knew now who he was, and they weren't there out of pity. They were there to thank him. For the first time in years, Walter Combs didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, not for medals he never wore, but for the quiet, unglamorous kindness he offered every single morning without expecting anything back. He knelt down, the dog licking his face, and finally let himself cry in front of people who understood exactly why. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who've given it everything. And sometimes all it takes is one person choosing to stop and really look. If this story moved you, stay close, because there are more stories like Walter's waiting to be told. Subscribe, and let's keep believing in the quiet heroes still among us.